I would like for all of us to take a couple of steps back. So join me in my little helicopter, and we're going to be on a flight looking at a landscape of changing things in flux. And I would like to take it off with talking about the word impermanence for a bit, and take a few steps back in time, where through the revolution of internet technology, we've been got accustomed to all kinds of funky and advanced services based on IP technology, but essentially they're all based on a very simple model where people, content, place, and time are in some kind of ratio brought together. Yeah? So it's actually not that complex. What you see is that in the last couple of years, things have become a bit more advanced, a bit more hyperlocal. Content was given different dimensions, but essentially it was all about connected experiences. Impermanence is something that is not new. That's something that has been around for ages, basically. What you see is that in culture, permanent things are things that you cannot move that easily. Solid things, anchor points. In innovation, which is part of my background, you learn to see patterns from the past. How can you learn from patterns in history, and how can you project your findings into the future and start writing scenarios, start imagining stories into the future and draw conclusions for the now. And that's what I would like to do today. One of the things that we've recently done at Adaptive Path is doing a project where we looked into service innovation in cities. And the remarkable thing of a city is that it's perceived as something that is quite permanent. It has a certain layout. It has certain buildings. The roads are the way they are. They don't change that fast. A city landscape is something that is quite patient. Although the people in the city change actually quite rapidly, and the perception of a city can be changed around in a very short period of time. What we've done recently is looking at a city, Copenhagen, where bicycles are quite common like in Amsterdam actually, but not all over the world. And how people use bicycles in Copenhagen to do different kind of things. And what you see is that they use the bicycle as a vehicle to manage what I call dynamic capacities. The bicycle becomes a way of transportation from A to B, but also to transport material goods. And there are a new wave of services emerging from that thinking that change the landscape of the street. It becomes a far more livable city. It's just as an example of that there are already things changing today that have the potential to become mass market in the future. But before I start doing that, let me give me a little bit of background of what I've been doing lately. I've been in the business for over 20 years. My background is actually in a combination of marketing, innovation, and design. So I've seen the business side of things. I really enjoy working with creatives and creative teams. But I also learned to speak the language of boardrooms and meet up with executives and driving ideas through into implementation. I've been introducing a couple of words that, things like Stardust, Liquid, Noise Control, Hypersense. This is a vocabulary that I introduced into boardrooms of companies, which is totally uncommon from the business language. Yeah. With the sole purpose to stretch people's imagination. Don't necessarily use the semantics that they hear every day, but inject a few words that spark an idea, inspire their imagination, and treat them as a creative team, which what you see is that boardrooms can become almost like a different place. Yeah? You should try it. I've been also doing some future work. This is a slide that you might have seen, some work that I contributed to, which was organized by Rudy de Waele by the end of last year, looking into the next 10 years, where, yet again, I introduced a few words like life flow and sense. which will come back in my presentation later on. But the bulk of the work that I've been doing is in sustainable energy, so in the sector of biomass and solar power, moving on to hardcore telecoms, so networking and value-added services, looking into future device experiences in the last couple of years, and also looking into emerging markets to reflect on what we currently see over here in the Western world as mature markets versus what's happening in eastern parts of Europe, in Asia, India in particular, and southern parts of Africa. Some of my work has been part of exhibitions. This in particular has been shown in Milano in the Design Institute. I've been doing some presentations on Lift and Max, so I use those as a platform for communication to spread around some of the ideas that I have. And the idea behind that is that I'd like to use these materials for people to use them in their own practice, take some of the things that I say and try to translate that into your own microcosmos to push things onwards. You know, I'm a kind of progressive person that is not satisfied with the current status quo, and I think I share that with a lot of people here in the audience, you know, based on the conversations that I've been having already tonight. Going back to the matter of life with impermanence, I already spoke a bit about the fundamental model underneath building experiences, I would dare to say, for the last 2 decades, which is based on this very simple diagram where 4 different dimensions are combined into one, where if you look at it closely, you can see that most of your services, if not all, can be plotted into this 2x2 matrix in a way. You know, you can see that the emphasis of you know, what is hot today might move into that spectrum somewhat, but it hardly ever breaks out of that spectrum. Yeah? Just to give you a few examples, you know, localized services are, you know, almost like the latest craze of yesterday, which makes a combination of space, content, time, and people. It's the aftermath of what used to be called, you know, social and hyperlocal, but it all fits into this model. In some cases, you see very fancy and advanced diagrams which are still based on this model, and you know, there are a whole, almost like a collection of diagrams that I already saw today, but essentially they go back to the same core. Why am I telling this? Then I put my innovation management hat on. What you see in innovation is that there's a certain heartbeat in developments throughout time, throughout different industry categories, and basically you see at some point an ignition point of new stuff coming through. That line eases out over time, and at the same time there's a new curve emerging. That's a very traditional model looking at new technology in breakthrough experiences. My hypothesis is that actually currently we're looking at an internet curve which is kind of flattening out. Yeah? That's not meant to, you know, kind of tell you that you're not doing the right thing, but it's an observation based on innovation management, like the pace and the frequency of new breakthrough experiences within the model I just showed you is slowing down. Yeah? Having said that, there must be evidence somewhere on the horizon that a new curve is about to kick in. Yeah? If the hypothesis is true, you can see both things at the same time. As a concept development person, I try to create a portfolio of experiments, different smaller types of projects, sometimes just looking at what's happening in the startup community, and build a portfolio that builds a trajectory into a new dimension. Now, it's also a very well-known methodology that is used in incubators, for example, not looking at the individual startups or the individual projects. If you're on the client side, you know, running a corporate team responsible for innovation, is build a portfolio, not focus on the individual efforts alone, but try to build relationships between multiple initiatives at the same time. Then you start to extrapolate, like if you take them all as a collection, Where is this whole thing moving? What's the direction? And that's scenario planning. Yeah? This is a step up towards scenario planning. So let's look at the horizon and see if we can identify a couple of things that give you evidence like, okay, what is this next wave? If there is one, where can we see the evidence? First one is an economic one, is just follow the money. Innovation is hungry in terms of investments. Yeah. Internet technology, there's still a huge amount of money invested into internet technology, into startups, into running businesses. Venture capital is still, in terms of volume, is still very active in that space. Although, what you can see is that the investment per initiative is going down. Yeah? The frequency, the volume is still there, but the investment levels are going down. If you compare that with, for example, other technologies, and I'm just looking at a model from Gartner where you see the traditional hype cycle, where stuff at the beginning of the cycle is very investment hungry, and further to the right, stuff is more or less more commodity-like. What you see at the beginning of that curve is that IP is no longer that dominant. It's still there. It's an enabler, has become more commodity-like, but it's no longer the new breakthrough. The new breakthrough technologies are actually into nanotechnology, biotechnology, neurotechnology. Clean is also a word that kind of combines the two. The investment levels in those technologies is by far higher than what is happening in the internet space. This is no evidence that this is going to take over in any way, but it is a signal on the horizon. Something is about to change. Yeah. Wouldn't it be interesting to see concepts coming through that make a combination between either internet technology or bio or neuro? What kind of experiences can we derive from that combination? Yeah. I think as a designer, that would really inspire me to think beyond the ordinary, beyond devices that have geometrical shapes and do not change while you use them and basically are based on one or two input paradigms. With this technology, you can think beyond those. As a metaphor, what is actually happening is that something that was quite permanent and was predictable and was a very static grid is slowly changing into a more dynamic model where things become more fluid, and eventually pictures especially in biotech nowadays more or less look like this. Yeah. This is just a picture of a protein, but for the same purpose, you could take this as a new paradigm for file structures and menu structures and get inspired by this kind of morphology instead of very static menu trees and grids and menus that you see on current phones, for example. Yeah. The hypothesis is actually that this will influence design going forward, and in 5, maybe 10 years, you will have different ways of accessing your data, different ways of interacting with data. And when we talk again in 5 years, I think they will look more like this and not like the first grid that I showed you, which actually stands for interfaces as we know them today. Yeah. Life with impermanence was actually a theme that came out of a study that I led when I was still over at Vodafone and leading the concept development team there, where we looked at culture as a driver for change. So we spoke a bit about technology, but now we're going to switch over to culture, because I'm a strong believer that culture drives design, and design is actually a manifestation of culture in the end of the day. And what we found in one of our studies is that one of the definitions here, life with impermanence supports the notion that everything around us underlies a permanent change, which is kind of a contradiction in itself. So it's living with impermanence, but the only thing that is permanent is change. So things become a constant flux. Yeah. As a mental model, this is the total opposite of what we are used to think. Yeah. We create solid anchor points for ourselves to move ourselves through the day. A calendar is a good example. A mobile phone with an address book is a good example. We kind of moved into the hierarchy of becoming a bit more advanced, but underneath, think back of the model with the 4 pillars, things are very fixed. Although they come across as very dynamic, they are very fixed. Yeah. What we should do as designers is actually turn that model upside down and think from the flux instead of the fixed. What I would like to do for the remainder of my presentation is give you a couple of what I call provocations, some design exercises that tell you, like, if you take that model from the other side, what kind of things could come out? And these are not universal truths. They can or cannot be true. That doesn't really matter. They are just there to provoke the thinking. Yeah. The first thing I ask myself is like, okay, Willem, that's all very nice, but where do you expect this to manifest itself? What is most likely the most obvious change that you see if you start to apply this kind of foresight? First of all, this is about changing places. That could be macro, like a landscape, a cityscape. It could be architecture, which is kind of in the same measurement as the human body. And it can be on a micro level, which is not even, you can't even see it with a human eye. But also in the way we move, in the way we move ourselves, in the way we transport things, and in the way we transport intangibles like, for example, energy, which goes back to the old days when I was still working in sustainable. And last but not least, it's also about the involvement that human beings have in both of those, both the layout, the physical layout of the surroundings around you, the way you move through it, and the involvement that you can or cannot have with that. Very abstract. Let me try to make that a bit more tangible by introducing the 3 provocations that I've got lined up for you here, with some new vocabulary to, make a change in the boardrooms of today, called mesh, morph, and swarm. I'm going to take you through them, but what they try to do, and that's for the purpose of Mobile Monday, is trying to translate this kind of abstract concept thinking into things that matter to your industry, which is about networks, nodes, and data in the end of the day. So I'll try to make an extra effort to take a step towards you to make this more tangible for you. The first one is mesh. I think you might have heard mesh in the context of networks. So-called meshed networks have been discussed for quite a long time already. It's actually interesting to see that only now, recently, that technology comes to fruition, where more and more handhelds, so-called phones, are enabled not only with a Wi-Fi receiver, but also with a transmitter. And if I were to work at an operator, which I'm no longer, I would be kind of scared, because it potentially bypasses the necessity for having a grid, a cellular network. Because if people start to use transmitters and receivers wherever they go, their dynamic capacity of a network moves with them. You're no longer a person that moves in a static grid. No, you have become part of something that is completely in flux. Yeah? The same actually would apply for energy. Because with solar paint, which is it's not an idea, it's actually something that has been developed in the labs. MIT is developing some interesting stuff there. Imagine you kind of spray solar paint on top of every object that consumes energy. Therefore, you essentially no longer have the need to attach it to an adapter. You just lay it in the sun, and it charges itself. That bypasses more or less the commodity of electricity, the electricity network, because you are no longer looking for a plug in the wall. You're looking for sun. Also think about the impact this has on mature versus emerging markets, whereas infrastructure, commodity infrastructure, is no longer the denominator between mature and emerging, because the infrastructure builds itself. Huge impact, quite disruptive. An interesting, because I'm in Holland, I was also looking for a Dutch example. Actually, I saw somebody speaking at the TU Delft the other day at a book presentation, speaking about the Q-box, which is a Dutch invention. And it's essentially an energy router for the home, where homes become production units for electricity, which you then can exchange with the grid. And in order to balance that exchange, you need the Q-box. It's a first step towards a revision of the model, and it flips the energy model completely upside down. Yeah? So the hypothesis is that this is happening. It's actually evidence, it's not a hypothesis. This is evidence that this is happening. The model is flipping from static to flux, and it will have impact on both telecoms as well as energy, and far beyond that. Second provocation is morph. Morph is more about objects. I was originally trained as a designer way back when, where I learned that if you design something and it gets produced, basically that's where the design process stops. The thing that leaves your hands or your workbench is going to stay like that. It might erode, so it wears off and it loses value, but it doesn't really change in the morphological sense. Yeah. What you can do with materials nowadays, coming from biotech, but also from mechanical engineering, is build objects that configure themselves. A good example is actually this little thing here, which has been developed by the University of Zurich, which is a mechanical model that, based on input of data, can take different shapes. And it's actually applied in interior architecture quite a bit, where, for example, an object that looks like a chair based out of these elements can change itself into a table based on its own configuration. Yeah? So if you start to see this kind of things, nothing that you perceive as a solid object is fixed. Everything is in flux. There are experiments in Japan. I think some of you might have seen that, where, well, in Japan in general, the apartments are relatively small compared to ours. There was an experiment not that long ago in Tokyo where there were apartments built based on this technology that could change themselves. The layout of the apartment could change during the day. Whereas when you're having breakfast, you need more space to sit at the table to have breakfast. If you go and watch television, you need a different configuration, and over time, the apartment could change. The layout of the apartment could change. So the application of this foresight is already there. Imagine that this could go into more micro levels. This is something that comes out of Nokia Labs, where elements that you use to build mobile phones are no longer fixed materials, but they configure themselves. There's another example that I've seen from another haptic company, where based on electricity, the characteristics of the material can change. It could either feel like it's something that resists my pressure, I can really squeeze it and it doesn't really change shape, and if it configures itself, it becomes almost like a sponge, and it's the same material. If you build objects based on that, you get a different sense of what that object, the qualities of that object can be. Yeah? And my prediction also for mobile phones is that you will see that kind of technology being used in mobile phones, where the way you manipulate data, the way you interact with data is changing from traditional input methods into far more human-esque type of input mechanisms and feedback mechanisms, which is, I would say, from an experience design perspective, is fantastic. The last one is swarm. I think this is actually the best documented and probably the most popular one. There are several books written on swarming theories, where one of the essentials of swarming is that it's a pattern that regulates itself. There is no preoccupied structure applied to it, but it seems to have some kind of inherent logic. Lots of research has been done in for example, how ants behave. How do they build their environments? And one of the essentials is that it's actually a swarm theory that drives them. Applying that knowledge onto our physical space, for example, a city, going back to the example of Copenhagen, what you get if you apply swarm technology to the urban landscape is that you no longer start your perception with the fixed, you rather focus on the flux. You look at the things that change. You look at capacities, dynamic capacities that you alone cannot really manage, but as a swarm, you can get advantage out of the swarm, out of the dynamic capacity. Yeah? Let me dive a bit deeper into that phenomena. Going back to Copenhagen, this is the layout of Copenhagen city nowadays, which some people perceive as quite advanced. From a cycling perspective, it actually is. Yeah? Because there are separate lanes for people that drive bicycles, because that's heavily promoted in Copenhagen. However, there's still lots of traffic from buses and lorries and vans and cars, and they are kind of separated from each other. So what is happening there is that, like, within the current layout of the city, there are certain things carved out for a specific way of transportation. Yeah? The blue line is only for bicycles, and they are heavily protected. If you go into studies of future landscapes in cities, Audi has done a fantastic study, which was recently presented, where the layout of the road is dynamically adjusted based on the demand that is in the city, where you don't have fixed chalk lines, painted on the tarmac, but you have LED lighting built into the surface, which can give you a different layout according to what's happening, what is actually needed in the urban space, which is based on swarm thinking. Yeah, if people go home, they go in the opposite direction. So you need more capacity that way, and it needs to be able to adjust itself. There's not like, at 10 o'clock we open the spitstrook, that's kind of the Dutch model. It needs to be far more dynamic. It's a nice attempt, but it doesn't really stand. If you look at it, if you think it through, there's a shift of thinking needed in order to apply new models. And I think from what I see here in the audience, where I've spoken to designers, I've spoken to people heavily in technology, I've seen a few people that like to think in strategy terms. I would really like to make a plea for applying some of this dynamic thinking into your daily work, because if we do that as a movement, you will get some of that swarming. So from Momo 18 here, I would expect some of this effect to take practice over time, and we can change things around as an audience here. So let me try to wrap it up in the interest of time, looking at the summary of what I've been trying to tell you here. There are a few insights that I would like you to take away from this talk. First of all, think in dynamic structures. Apply the inside of what you see happening around you. Don't start with the fixed, but think in flux. And apply that with innovation technology that you see coming through from either biotech, neuro, clean, and try to apply that in IP technology and merge them up into new experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Willem.